Every house I know of has a mirror. In fact, it's probably pretty safe to say that almost all of them have several. This way, people can periodically check their physical appearances. So we know it would be foolish for someone to choose to ignore the mirror because it's easier than actually dealing with the truth about what the mirror shows. Yet that is exactly what many people choose to do with God's Word. In James chapter 1 and verses 22 through 25, God compares His Word to a mirror. He says, "But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. Because if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he's like someone looking at his own face in a mirror. For he looks at himself, goes away, and immediately forgets what kind of person he was. But the one who looks intently into the perfect law of freedom and perseveres in it, and is not a forgetful hearer, but a doer who works, this person will be blessed in what he does." Since God's Word is a mirror for the soul, to see if you are right in God's sight, it is even more foolish to learn the truth and choose to ignore it. Yet some people determine that there are times when it is easier to ignore the truth and choose to do nothing with what God's Word says. Consider a few examples. Number one, sometimes it's easier to ignore the truth when it requires you to change something you don't want to change. There will be times whenever God's Word will expose things in your life that need to be changed. Maybe you need to change the way you talk. Maybe you need to change the way you dress. Maybe you need to change your habits. Maybe you need to change what you do for entertainment. Maybe you need to change something about your relationships. Regardless, don't try to ignore what the mirror shows you about the changes you need to make. Second, sometimes it's easier to ignore the truth when it requires you to step outside of your comfort zone. There will be times whenever God's Word will show you some areas in which you could be doing more to serve God. Maybe you need to ask someone to study the Bible with you. Maybe you need to invite someone to worship services. Maybe you need to serve a complete stranger. Maybe you need to be hospitable and open up your home to a brother or sister you don't know very well. Maybe you need to rebuke someone who's in sin. Maybe you need to encourage and strengthen someone who's weak. Regardless, don't try to ignore what the mirror shows you about the steps you need to take outside of your comfort zone. Number three, sometimes it's easier to ignore the truth when it requires you to stand against someone you love. There will be times whenever God's Word will show you the need to take a stand against someone you love. Maybe you need to rebuke a loved one for some sin. Maybe you have to refuse an invitation from a loved one to do something God doesn't approve. Maybe you have to withdraw from someone you love. Maybe you have to choose between having a relationship with God or with a loved one. Regardless, don't try to ignore what the mirror shows you about the stand you must take. And then number four, sometimes it's easier to ignore the truth when it requires you to take a stand that is not popular. There will be times whenever God's Word will tell you to stand in such a way that will open you up to ridicule from the world. Maybe you'll have to take a stand against the actions or opinions of your coworkers or boss. Maybe you'll have to stand against a teacher or classmate. Maybe you'll have to teach someone something that will not be easily accepted. Regardless, don't try to ignore what the mirror shows you about the stand you must take. Just like ignoring what a mirror shows you doesn't change the reality of the situation, ignoring what God's Word shows you doesn't change what God requires from you. While it may be easier to ignore the truth in some situations, ignoring the truth will not help you be saved. In fact, you will only be saved when you learn and obey what God's Word says.